Hi, well, today I'm with my friend Lukas Gentele, CEO and co-founder of Loft Labs, which is a fast-growing startup that greatly reduces costs associated with Kubernetes, and it allows developers self-service access to Kubernetes clusters without having to be a Kubernetes admin. Lukas, you've just received Series A funding of 24 million, and you've experienced 400% growth in revenue in 2023. So why all the excitement and attraction about vCluster?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, vCluster is an amazing technology. It's an open source project that a lot of developers need. A lot of platform engineering teams are building on top of vCluster. And I think we've been really fortunate to build this, community and this kind of thriving open source motion. And obviously, in the past couple of years, efficiency in the Kubernetes space has become very important. Previously, it was all about like, how do we get Kubernetes in people's hands, right? And people did crazy things of like, hey, let's just spin up another cluster for everything, right? And then, oh, suddenly we have like 2,000 clusters, right? Like nobody really uh cared too much about like the cost, or was like really much more important. It was much more important to grow and to deliver that API and that access to Kubernetes. But now people are thinking, how can we streamline this? How can we reduce cost? How can we make this more efficient? And then vCluster is just an amazing solution. By virtualizing Kubernetes, you can save like, 50 to 70% of the cost associated with it. And that's obviously a very, very compelling argument.
So there is a trend to reduce overall costs associated with Kubernetes, and there's a trend to do self-service for developers. So what makes vCluster so different?
I think what makes vCluster different is it looks at a different architecture, because everybody looked at this problem of, companies needing 1,000 clusters. Um, and their answer was essentially, fleet management. Let's automate things,
Hmm.
right? But that's just like plumbing around it. We were the only ones that looked at the space and really said like, no, automation doesn't make this any better. You actually need to question the architecture. And the architecture so far has been single tenant Kubernetes clusters, and we're shifting it over to multi-tenant clusters. People have been doing this with namespaces beforehand, but namespaces are too weak of an isolation layer for most enterprises. It's too insecure. It doesn't provide the developer autonomy that a lot of folks need. And, it's really hard to build a business on top of this when you're just automating some little existing pieces. Versus for us, we're creating this new virtualization layer on top, and that's just something entirely new. It's a completely new approach. When we, that has its benefits, obviously, but it also has its downsides, because, when we approach somebody and talk about virtual clusters at first, that the first question that comes up, whoa, isn't Kubernetes already virtualized, right? Why do we need this extra layer, right? And there's just a lot of concerns and questions. But the same happened when containers started. Everybody was wondering, is this as secure and safe as our VMs? And today nobody's asking that anymore. The world runs on containers,
Hmm.
and nobody's questioning it. The question shifts towards, what else can we do with it? Where else can we put this? And I think the same thing is happening with vCluster.
So you mentioned security. So would you say virtual clusters are more secure? How would you describe that?
Yeah, virtual clusters isolate the Kubernetes control plane. So instead of having, when you're switching from 1,000 clusters to one in the most extreme case, then everybody's relying on that one cluster, right? So everybody's hitting the same API server. And with virtual clusters, while you still can consolidate things into fewer clusters, you do have these virtual clusters in the middle that kind of are a sharding layer to split up the load, but also protect that underlying real API server, right? So when you're running on top of AWS and EKS, or on Google Cloud with GKE, you're not actually handing out that GKE or EKS API server to your engineers. You're handing out the virtual cluster API server. And, if they bring that down, their virtual cluster is down, but the underlying cluster still runs. And I think that is something very unique that just creates a lot more resilience. And that is obviously very, very beneficial. And apart from that, the attack vector gets smaller, because you can fine granular decide what is accessible in that vCluster and what is not accessible. So locking things down like the network, or locking things down like access to certain objects in Kubernetes, is just much easier in a virtual cluster than it would be in a namespace of a larger physical cluster.
So how big is the addressable market for vCluster?
Yeah, I think some of the most interesting markets that venture capitalists get excited about are the ones that are actually building up while the company is growing.
Hmm.
And I think we're probably in that spot. So right now, when you look at how many virtual clusters are out there, right? There's 40 million virtual clusters out there. That's quite a bit already.
Now, is that your
But
clusters or is that just in general?
yeah, that's our virtual clusters,
Okay.
right?
All right.
But that's already quickly surpassing the number of real clusters out there, right? And
Ah.
that's something to consider as well, right? It's kind of like when you look at Uber and the taxi market, I don't know how many taxis you took before Uber was around, right? But I'm calling
Occasionally.
Ubers all the time, right? And they just massively blew up the market. Like the market for ride hailing now is much, much bigger than it was
Hmm.
pre-Uber. So that company didn't just take an existing market, it actually blew up that market just because it was much, much easier for people to use that service and it was much more, convenient to use it. The experience was better, right? And ultimately, I think that drives more and more people into that space. The same will happen with us. There may be people that potentially even stay away from Kubernetes because of, they're already seeing that management hassle, or there may be people that run with Kubernetes and hit certain limits and then they stop creating new clusters, right? With virtual clusters, these burdens go away and these hurdles go away, and suddenly, yes, you can have 3,000 virtual clusters in your company. Why not? Right?
Hmm.
Versus previously, that's a very scary thought, and only very few companies embraced on that journey, whether they wanted it or not, right? Maybe they had deep enough pockets to go there. But with virtual clusters, we'll see a lot more companies that will have like 5,000 or even 10,000 clusters in their
Hmm.
company.
You mentioned ease of use. So for developers, is it an easy to use UI? They really don't need to know Kubernetes. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's still Kubernetes, right? So you still have to deploy your applications with Helm or Argo CD or any of these tools, right?
Hmm.
You still got to work with Kubernetes, but I think what we're abstracting away as well with virtualization um, is in a way the underlying infrastructure as well. And there are obviously already things out there like, EKS on Fargate and those kind of solution, or GKE Autopilot, where you don't have to worry too much about the nodes anymore, right? And obviously, we're taking that a level higher, even further. So you're moving further away from the infrastructure, but you are still retaining that Kubernetes API paradigm. And I think that's something very powerful. Because when you ask me about what's the power of Kubernetes, it's not like orchestrating to nodes and wiring up the network. It's the massive API convention of how things are defined and how things are deployed and how things are orchestrated. The same as, Docker, the Docker file, right? Like those standards that so many other tools are then building on top of create that interchangeability and they create that ecosystem around. I mean, that's why there's like 3,000 tools in the CNCF landscape and there's so much choice, right? Because of that common API standard. And I think that is something important. And I think that's something that people will want to learn and will want to engage with, whether it's through, some kind of extraction or they're running, kubectl commands directly.
Recently announced some partnerships. So Rancher, Coreweave, like what are some of the partnerships that you recently announced?
Yeah, I mean, Coreweave is one of our greatest customers ever because they're like super, vocal about how they're using our technology. It's pretty rare for a cloud provider to actually, open up the hood and say like, "Hey, this is how it's wired up under the hood here." And we're very fortunate that they're super open about this. And then we created this Rancher integration. Yeah, we already have a Vault integration as well. We already have Terraform integration, Cluster API is out there, right? And Rancher was just the next logical step for us where we saw a lot of demand. People asked about, hey, they actually asked publicly on GitHub in, Rancher's GitHub repositories, right? Hey, I tried to put vClusters in Rancher and like there's these problems. I can create real clusters, I can create namespace. Why can't I create virtual clusters, right? And we're kind of just stepping in and building it and launching this. So I think for us, the strategy going forward is creating more and more of these integrations because we see plugging into these existing platforms that people use is very, very valuable.
So when you think about an ideal customer, what's the profile? Is it a size of company, or is it amount of Kubernetes clusters that they're currently using, or what's the profile that you look for?
Yeah, I would really say it's not necessarily the state that they're in today. It's really the trajectory that they're on. So they may just have 30 Kubernetes clusters, but they really would like to create 200 in the next 3 years, right? But they know they don't want to do that, right? That's a perfect customer for us,
Hmm.
despite obviously today their footprint is relatively small, right? Because they're holding back, right? But then there's other customers that already have 500 plus clusters, right? And they're obviously very clear target for us, right? By telling them, hey, maybe you should rethink that strategy, right? And we don't tell them necessarily migrate everything off and like immediately,
Hmm.
break everything. We typically tell them, how many clusters did you create in the past 12 months? Oh, 80? So you're probably going to create like 100 next 12 months,
Hmm.
How about in these 12 months, you spin up virtual clusters, 100 virtual clusters instead, right? So put
Hmm.
a pause to that explosive growth in real clusters, and then we slowly migrate things over time.
Hmm.
Um, and then I think another really interesting segment for us is, in this whole like wave of AI and GPU heavy workloads, we play a pretty essential role because when you're thinking about stories like Coreweave or Lintasarta, companies that want to, make GPUs accessible for all these AI workloads, all these AI companies and initiatives to train their models on, then the question really is like, how do you hand out GPUs? You have to have some kind of API, and Kubernetes is the standard API for accessing compute these days, right? So for them, it makes sense to give everybody a cluster, every customer, maybe every user within a customer account, right? Maybe a customer needs 8 different virtual cluster because different teams are working on this and need to access GPUs. So if you would have asked me about whether cloud providers would be an ideal customer for us, if you would have asked that like 3 years ago when we started on the vCluster journey, I would have said like, no, I don't know how, why would that be interesting for them? Today, I see that very clearly. We see so much demand in that direction.
Hmm.
All these next gen clouds and especially GPU heavy cloud providers are really, really excited about what we're doing.
This has been really interesting. So, how would you like people to engage with you or to learn more about vCluster? What's the best way for people to get exposure or learn more or try it out? What's your preferred method?
Yeah, I mean, obviously check out our GitHub repository. Check out vCluster.com. Has a lot of interesting, nice little graphics on the website that explain how virtual clusters work and how to use it. And then our Slack channel is a great way to get in touch with us. It's on slack.vcluster.com. Just join there, reach out. We're super
Hmm.
friendly. Don't be shy, right? There's about 3,000 plus people on there. Very, very interesting conversations. And yeah, other than that, me personally, just hit me up on LinkedIn. Very open to anyone who's curious about what we're building.
Cool. Awesome. Well, this has been great, Lucas. Thanks again for your time, and we'll be in touch.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Walter.
Okay.